I've been developing my system, the body matrix, for nearly a year. After spending so much time researching different style systems, finding their strengths and weaknesses, I found that I had my own perspective on body types, which I felt wasn't being represented by any other style system that I was working with. Using 3 dichotomies, wide versus narrow, long versus short, and straight versus round, I have identified 27 unique body types, which focus on your unique characteristics to help you shine best. In this video, I'm going to break down the 27 body types. If you would like an overall understanding of how this system works, you can check out this video. And in this video, I really wanted to show how they translate to the Kibbe body types, and also just show some examples of what each type looks like and how they might dress. My name is Ellie-Jean, I'm a style consultant, and on this channel, we've met our style by finding ourselves. For a quick reminder on how the body matrix works, there are some key terms you need to know. So let's start with wide versus narrow. If someone is wide, it typically means they have broad shoulders, or their shoulders are the dominant point of their frame. They'll often have width in their upper body and rib cage as well. And these words are very, very literal. So there's not some secret, deeper, hidden meaning. It's literally just having like wide shoulders. And it also means you have a kind of wide, blunt, angular bone structure. So it continues throughout your frame. Narrowness is the opposite of this, is where your shoulders aren't really a dominant feature in your frame. They're very narrow, and you can look at this shoulder point here. Width kind of shows as more of a horizontal line, whereas narrowness is much more vertical. Medium width is where you couldn't really describe someone as narrow or wide. They fit somewhere neatly in the middle. Long versus short. Now you have the obvious example of this, which is literally tall and literally short. So if you're over 5'7", you should probably be considering long lines. If you're under 5'4", you should probably be considering short lines. And if you're somewhere in the middle, you should consider medium lines. However, there's also your vertical line, which is how tall you look. So if you are short and you look short, I would consider short. If you look short and you look a little bit taller than you are, I'd probably consider medium, and vice versa. For shape, straight shapes are angular geometric lines in your frame. So typically this might mean having a straight waist, but it doesn't necessarily stop there. If you look at your line drawing, it's about the lines of your chest, your hips, even your limbs as well, and your shoulders. Everything comes together to create this full picture. So it's not just about your chest to waist to hip ratio, like in the fruit system. It's about your overall frame coming together. So straight shapes are more geometric, more angular, lots of straight lines going on. Even if that creates a kind of hourglass, if all the shapes are very geometric, I would consider straight lines. Rounded shapes are the opposite of this. They're very curved, they're very soft, they're very rounded. You're really looking at the chest and the hips. I would almost like ignore the waist altogether. It's when you look at your chest, does it create a round shape? Do your hips create a round shape, or are they more angular and geometric? And medium is somewhere in the middle. They either have a mix or a blended version of both of these elements. So let's start with wide, medium, medium. This type has width in their frame, they have a moderate vertical line, and they have medium shape, so they're neither particularly curvy nor very geometric. In terms of Kibbe, this type would probably be classed as a flamboyant natural, as they have width. However, you could also see some soft naturals in this category as well. So it's bridging that gap between flamboyant natural and soft natural. Typically, this type looks best in draped lines, draped fabrics, wide necklines, wide sleeves, flared skirts, wide hems, with a very, very slightly defined waist. So not overly cinched, but not completely obscured either, somewhere in the middle. Their fabric won't be too structured, it won't be too clingy, it will typically be quite draped, and they will wear moderate lengths. So typically around knee to calf length is best for the overall length of the outfit, but you're also looking at around the hip point and around the ankle point. Wide, medium, straight. This type has width in their frame, so they appear quite angular, they have broad shoulders, they have a moderate vertical line, so they don't look particularly long nor short, and they have straight lines in their frame, so they have more angular geometric shapes in their silhouette. In Kibbe, this would translate to flamboyant natural quite seamlessly. So this type will look best in straight lines, geometric shapes, slightly heavy fabrics. They'll look good in wide necklines like off shoulder, flared sleeves, flared legs, flared skirts, draped but heavy fabrics with structured shapes. The wide, medium, round body type. So this type has width in their frame, in their shoulders. They have that kind of blunt, angular bone structure. They have a moderate vertical line, so they look medium in height, look best in medium lengths, and they have these round, curvy shapes to their frame. They feel very soft. This type would most likely fit the soft natural Kibbe type, but potentially on their height, the flamboyant natural type as well. They look best in draped fabrics, flared sleeves, wide necklines, flared legs, with waist definition and rounded shapes like rounded necklines. Fabrics typically are soft and draped, and they look really good in openness with soft, slightly heavy fabrics. The wide, short, medium body type has width in their frame, so they have kind of wide shoulders, they have a blunt bone structure, they have a short vertical line, so they look short and typically are short, and they have medium shapes, so they're not really curvy curvy and soft, but they're also not very angular and geometric. They're somewhere in the middle. It'd be hard to describe them as either. This type best translates to soft natural. It could also translate to a flamboyant natural or soft gamine, but typically we see naturals in this type. So this type looks best in width, so wide necklines, open sleeves, flared legs, flared skirts, draped fabrics, but with short lines. So that means like above the hip if it's a top. It typically means above the knee generally, but if you were going to like a formal event where you need a maxi length, it would mean above the ankle. It also means trousers above the ankle, and medium shapes, so shapes that are neither really structured nor really fussy. Typically this means kind of like draped but short lines. Typically the fabrics are neither like really structured nor really soft, so they'll find this middle ground. The wide, short and straight body type. So this type has width in their frame, so they have a blunt bone structure, they have wide shoulders, wide upper body, they have a short vertical line, so they look short, they are short, and they have straight angular shapes in their frame. This type again would translate to a flamboyant natural, but they're often flamboyant naturals that people can see an element of the flamboyant gamine in them. So if you're seeing arguments between are they a flamboyant natural, are they flamboyant gamine, they're probably this type. So this type I find looks best in kind of wide open sleeves, wide necklines, flared skirts, flared legs, but there's a little bit of structure to the fabric, and they have short lines again, so that means above the hip, above the knee typically, but for a maxi length it means above the ankle. It could be kind of draped silhouettes with structured fabrics, I think is the pattern I see the most looking best. The wide, short and round body type, this type has width in their frame, so they have broad shoulders, a wide upper body, a blunt bone structure, they have a short vertical line, which means they look short, they are short, and they also have rounded shapes in their frame, so they have a soft, curvy feel. This type most obviously fits into soft natural, but you might also see soft gamines here, or potentially even romantics. So this type looks best in wide necklines, open sleeves, flared legs, flared skirts, draped fabrics with waist definition and round, soft shapes that are clingy around the chest and the hips. They also look best in short lines, so that's typically above the knee or above the hip if it's a top, or above the ankle if it's a maxi length. Wide, long, medium. So this type has width in their frame, so they have wide shoulders, a blunt bone structure with a long vertical line, which means they look long and they typically are tall. And they are medium in shape, so you couldn't describe them as particularly curvy and soft, but you also couldn't really describe them as angular and geometric. They're somewhere in the middle, or they have elements of both. You might also see a lot of people here who are flamboyant natural, but there are arguments about whether they're a soft dramatic because they don't fit quite neatly in either one. So this type looks best in draped fabrics, open sleeves, open legs, flared skirts. They look good with a softly defined waist, so it's not really cinched, it's not very obscured, it's somewhere in the middle. They look good in long lines, so typically this means maxi length. It means kind of around the ankle point or below the knee, but it could also mean like below the hip if it was a blazer, for instance. I also feel like really long types can look good in mini lengths, especially when they're young. So if it's like a really short skirt, as long as the top is also below the hip, I feel like that hits the below the hip mark, and then your legs can kind of carry the rest. The wide, long, straight body type has width in their frame. They have broad shoulders, an angular bone structure, width in the chest and upper body. They have a long vertical line, which means they look long, they typically are tall, and they have straight geometric lines in their frame. So this means they don't need to accommodate any curve. They look really good in straight lines, angular shapes. This type is your obvious flamboyant natural. This is the type that looks best in really oversized styles. They can take a lot of fabric and still look really chic and cool rather than like they're being drowned. They look good in wide legs, wide sleeves, draped fabrics, but draped fabrics with a little bit of structure tends to work best for this type because they have those straight lines. The wide, long and round body type, they tend to have width in their shoulders and upper body. They have a long vertical line, so they look long and they are long, and they have rounded shapes in their chest and hips. It's definitely a type where people can't agree if they're a flamboyant natural or a soft dramatic. I have an entire video on this type already. Hopefully over time I will have videos on every single one of these body types, but this is the type that really got me into creating the body matrix because I saw this real flaw. For women who have width, they have curve and they have long vertical line. I can't see why these things shouldn't exist together, and they absolutely do. So this type looks best in draped fabrics, long lines, open sleeves, flared legs, waist definition, and clinginess in the chest and hips. Medium, long, medium. This type has medium width in the shoulders, so they're neither particularly broad nor narrow. They're somewhere in the middle. They have a moderate bone structure. They have a long vertical line, which means they look long and they are long. They're typically quite tall, and they have a medium shape, so you couldn't really describe them as straight and geometric and angular, but you also couldn't really describe them as soft and rounded and curvy, or you could describe them as both. You could see them fitting into either category. This type is typically typically you can't decide if they're a flamboyant natural, a soft dramatic, or a dramatic. They fall somewhere between all three of those types. And they look best in medium width, so open lines rather than flared or cinched, not loose and draped nor fitted. They look good in long lines, so typically that means maxi lengths, but it also means going below the hip, below the knee, below the ankle. And medium shapes, so they're not particularly fussy and soft and rounded, but they're also not structured. They can have a slightly defined waist, which isn't really cinched nor obscured. Medium, long, straight. This type has medium width in their frame, so they're not really broad, they're not really narrow, they're somewhere in the middle. They have a long vertical line, they look long, and they typically are tall, and they have straight lines in their frame, so they're not soft and rounded and curvy, they're more angular. This type is somewhere between your flamboyant natural and your dramatic. And they look good in openness, but not flared, loose shapes, nor cinched and fitted shapes. They look good in long lines, so typically that means maxi lengths or below your stopping point, so below the hip if it's a blazer, below the knee if it's something short, and straight lines with geometric shapes and a little bit of structure to the clothing as well, rather than being soft and clingy. Medium, long, round. This type has medium width in the shoulders. You wouldn't describe them as broad, you wouldn't describe them as narrow. They have a kind of moderate bone structure. They're not particularly blunt, they're not particularly lithe. They're somewhere in the middle. They have a long vertical line, so it means they look long, they typically are tall, and they have a soft, round, curvy feel to their chest and hips and bone structure generally. This type is your soft dramatic, your typical soft dramatic. So not the narrow end of the soft dramatic, but your very much slap bang in the middle soft dramatic. You could potentially see them as flamboyant naturals or dramatics, but it's unlikely. They're very, very soft. So this type looks best in openness, so not flared and loose lines, nor cinched and fitted. Long lines, so typically that means maxi lengths, but also below the knee. And round shapes, so defined waists, clingy fabrics, fitted around the chest and the hips, with just generally soft, rounded shapes. Medium, medium, medium. I get most questions about this type. I think because when you just see those words, it's hard to picture it. So let's break it down. Medium width, they're not particularly broad, they're not particularly narrow, they're somewhere in the middle. They've got a moderate bone structure. They don't feel particularly light in the bone structure, they don't feel heavy in the bone structure, they're somewhere in the middle. They have a moderate vertical line, so they don't look short, they don't look long. And also their shapes, it's hard to define them as curvy and soft and rounded, but you also couldn't particularly describe them as sharp and angular and straight. They're somewhere in the middle. This type would be your true classic. You can't decide if they're a dramatic classic or a soft classic. But I would also say you might see some other types in here. You might see some soft naturals in here. I would say you could see some flamboyant naturals in here, but typically you're going to see classics in this category. This type looks good in shapes which are open but not flared and loose and draped, that aren't cinched or fitted and really tight, but somewhere in the middle, open and straight. Moderate length, so typically that's around knee length for the overall look, or kind of on the hip if you're talking about a top or a jacket. And they have medium shapes, so not really fussy and soft and clingy, but also not very geometric and sharp and angular. And their waist will be softly defined, so not really, really tight and cinched, but also not loose and obscured. Medium, medium straight. This type has medium width in their upper body, so they're not particularly wide nor narrow, they're not broad, they're not sloped. They have a moderate vertical line, so they don't look particularly long, they don't look particularly short, they're somewhere in the middle. Typically they're between 5'4" and 5'7", but not always. And they tend to have straight geometric lines in their frame. They're not particularly curvy and rounded. They're very notably straight in their shapes. This type, typically you see dramatic classics. You could even see some soft naturals here where people can't decide if they're soft natural or dramatic classic. And their best lines are open but not flared shapes in the sleeves, the skirts, and the trouser legs. Moderate length, so typically that means around knee length or calf length, or hip length if we're talking about a jacket, for instance, around the actual hip point, as well as straight lines, so geometric shapes with a little bit of structure to the fabric. So not soft and airy, but quite structured. The medium round body type has moderate width, so they're neither particularly wide nor narrow. They're somewhere in the middle. They have a moderate vertical line, so they don't look long, they don't look short, they look kind of medium. They feel quite balanced generally in the bone structure, but they lean soft, so they have soft, rounded shapes throughout their chest and hips. Typically, you're going to see soft classics in this category. You might see romantics that fall somewhere between romantic and soft natural in this category as well. They look best in openness, so open sleeves, skirts, trouser legs that aren't particularly flared and loose and draped, nor fitted and cinched. Moderate length, so typically this means around knee length, with soft, rounded shapes, with a very well-defined waist, with clinginess in the chest and hips. Medium, short, medium. So this type is neither particularly wide nor narrow in the shoulders. They're kind of balanced in their bone structure, but they have a short vertical line, so they look short and typically they are short. They're also medium in shape, so they're neither really curvy and soft, nor are they really angular and geometric, but they're somewhere in the middle, or they have a mix of both. This type, I would say, is somewhere between flamboyant gamine and soft gamine. You might also see types here where you can't decide if they're a soft natural or a flamboyant gamine or a soft gamine. They're like a little bit stronger in bone structure than the gamine types, and they also fall somewhere between soft and straight as well. So this type looks best in short lines, so that's typically above the knee, but also above the hip or above the ankle. They look good in shapes which are open, so not flared, not cinched, but somewhere in the middle, so kind of open sleeves, straight skirts. Nothing's really fitted and tight, but it's also not like oversized and baggy either. It's just kind of clean. And for medium shapes, they're not really fussy, they're not really structured, they're somewhere in the middle. You couldn't describe them as really defined on the waist, but you couldn't really describe them as obscured waist either. Medium, short, straight. So this type has medium width, so they're not overly broad and they're not overly narrow. They have a moderate bone structure, which is in the middle. They're short, so they have a short vertical line, and they have straight lines in their frame, so they have geometric shapes throughout their silhouette. This type is kind of your flamboyant gamine meets soft natural, or flamboyant gamine even meets flamboyant natural, where people can't quite decide, but they lean on the sharper end. This type typically looks good in crop lengths, open but not flared, sleeves, skirts, and trouser legs. Not overly fitted and cinched, but also not oversized and baggy either, somewhere in the middle, with kind of short lengths, so that's typically above the knee, and straight lines with slightly structured fabric, so the fabric doesn't feel really soft and clingy, but has structure to it. Medium, short, and round. This type has medium width, so they're neither really broad nor really narrow. They're somewhere in the middle. They have a kind of moderate bone structure. They have a short vertical line, so they look short, typically they are short, and they have soft, round, curvy frame. This type is typically your soft gamines, your romantics, potentially soft naturals who aren't particularly wide. So this type look best with openness, but not really wide, so they're kind of not really close to the neck, not really broad on the shoulders. They're not fitted sleeves, but they're not kind of open, flared, fluttery sleeves. They're kind of in the middle, just open. Straight skirts typically, not really narrow and cinched and tight, but also not really flared and loose and draped, so somewhere in the middle, clean shapes. Short lines, so typically above the knee, typically above the hip, and rounded shapes, so waist definition, soft rounded shapes in the chest and hips, round skirts, round trouser legs, that kind of thing. So lastly, we have the narrow types. Starting with narrow, medium, medium. This type has narrowness in their frame, so they typically have narrow shoulders, which aren't the dominant feature of their frame. They have a moderate vertical line, so they don't look long, they don't look short, they look somewhere in the middle, and they're quite medium in shape. They're not very geometric, they're not very angular, but you also couldn't really describe them as soft and rounded. They're somewhere in the middle. Typically, you see people here where you can't decide if they're a soft classic or a dramatic classic, so you get a lot of true classics in this category. You might also get some long gamines here, so gamines where they look very gamine-ish, but they're longer than you'd expect in a gamine. So they don't fall neatly into the gamine type because they don't look that short. This type looks good in close shapes, so that means close necklines, fitted cinched sleeves, kind of tapered trousers, fitted skirts with moderate lengths, so typically that means around the knee point or around the hip point, with medium shapes that are neither really geometric and sharp, but also not really soft and rounded. They're quite clean and neat. You couldn't really describe the shapes as either way. They have a slightly defined waist, which isn't really fitted, but also not an obscured waist either, somewhere in the middle. Narrow, medium, straight. This type has narrowness in the shoulders, so their shoulder isn't the dominant point of their frame. They might be slightly pear-shaped. They tend to have a medium vertical line. This means they don't look long, they don't look short, they look somewhere in the middle. And they have straight lines in their frame, so they have a lot of geometric shapes, angular shapes, rather than soft and rounded shapes. This type is usually dramatic classics, but you also get your longer flamboyant gamines here, where they don't feel quite flamboyant gamine because they're not really that small, they're leaning a little bit longer. So if they have a kind of classic feel, a gamine feel, they're probably here. And they look best in close necklines, fitted sleeves, cinched shapes, tapered legs with moderate lengths. Typically that means around the knee point or around the hip point for like jackets, as well as straight geometric lines, so fabrics with a little bit of structure, and obscured waists or lowered waists. Narrow, medium, round. This type has narrowness in the shoulders. Their shoulders aren't a dominant point in their frame. They might be slightly pear-shaped. They have a moderate length, so they don't look particularly short, but they don't look particularly tall either. They're somewhere in the middle. And they have soft, rounded shapes to their frame, especially their chest and hips. So they have a real curvy feel. This type is kind of your long theatrical romantics where they look a little bit too tall. You get soft classics here as well. So essentially, if you're struggling to place them as a soft classic, a theatrical romantic, a romantic, maybe even a soft gamine, this is the type that you probably are. And this type looks best with closed necklines, fitted sleeves, tapered legs, with waist definition, clinginess around the chest and the hips, and lots of round shapes like round skirts and soft fabrics like silk fabrics and so on, as well as moderate length, so typically that means around the knee. Narrow, long, medium. This type has narrowness in the shoulders, so they're not broad, they're very narrow. The shoulders aren't their dominant feature. They have a long vertical line, so they look long and they typically are tall, and they have medium shapes in their frame, so they don't look particularly soft and rounded, nor really straight and angular. This type is somewhere between your dramatic and your soft dramatic. It's the most narrow of the dramatic types. And typically they look good in closed necklines, fitted sleeves or cinched sleeves, tapered legs, fitted skirts with long lines. So typically this means maxi lengths, but it also means like below the hip if it's a jacket, for instance, with medium shapes that aren't particularly curvy and soft and rounded, but they also aren't really geometric either. They don't have obscured waists, they have slightly defined waists, and they fall somewhere in the middle. The narrow, long, and straight body type. This type has narrowness in the shoulders, which means they're not broad, they're not moderate, they're notably narrow. They typically have a delicate bone structure and narrowness in the upper body, and that means they can sometimes have a bit of a pear shape. They tend to have a long vertical line, so this means they look long and they're typically tall, and they have straight or angular geometric lines in their silhouette. This type is your very typical dramatic. They tend to look best in narrow lines, so closed necklines, fitted sleeves, tapered cuffs, skinny jeans, kind of skirts that are fitted, long lines, so that typically means maxi lengths, but it also means longer than your stopping point, so longer than your hip, longer than your knee, and so on. And straight lines, so having an obscured waist, or potentially a lowered waist, something like a drop waist, or even an empire waist. Having structured fabric, which feels stiff, having lots of straight lines in the overall silhouette of the outfit. Narrow, long, and round. This type is narrow, so they're not broad, they have narrow shoulders, they tend to have a delicate bone structure, they have a long vertical line, which means they look long and they're typically tall, and they have soft, rounded shapes in their chest and hips. This type is your more narrow, soft dramatic, and sometimes these are soft dramatics where you could see them as a pure dramatic as well, but they're really curvy. So this type looks best in closed necklines, fitted sleeves, lots of fitted shapes, kind of your typical hourglass shape, close, like tapered legs, as well as round shapes, so fitted waists, really cinched waists, clinginess on the chest and hips as well. The narrow, short, and medium body type. They're narrow, so they're not broad, they're not moderate in their shoulders, and this continues through the rest of their bone structure. They have a short vertical line, so they look short, and they do tend to be short. And they've got medium shapes, so you couldn't really describe them as really curvy and soft, but you couldn't really describe them as sharp and geometric and angular either. They're somewhere in the middle. This type is people you couldn't easily fit in soft gamine or flamboyant gamine. They're somewhere in the middle. They kind of have the compact feel of the soft gamine, but not all of the soft rounded shapes. I feel like you're most likely to see soft gamines in this category, but I suppose technically you could also find some theatrical romantics here, although it's unlikely. I feel like that's mainly what you're gonna see. And they look good in narrowness, so close necklines, fitted skirts, tapered legs, fitted cinched sleeves, short lines, so typically that means above the knee or above any other stopping points, and medium shapes, so shapes that aren't really soft and curvy and rounded and fussy, but also not structured and geometric and angular, but somewhere in the middle or a mix of both. Narrow, short, and straight. This type is narrow in the shoulders, and they tend to have a narrow bone structure. They have a short vertical line, so they look short and they do tend to be short, and they have straight shapes in their frame, so they have kind of straight waists, angular shapes in the chest and hips. This is your typical flamboyant gamine. This type looks best in closed necklines, fitted sleeves, tapered legs, as well as short lines, so usually that means above the knee or above any of the stopping points. And they look good in straight lines, so that means either an obscured or a lowered waist. Lots of straight shapes throughout the silhouette, such as straight skirts, no rounded shapes, nothing clingy, and a little bit more structure in the fabric as well. And narrow, short, and round, our final type. This type has narrowness in the shoulders and throughout their bone structure generally. They feel like they have quite a delicate bone structure. They have a short vertical line, so they look short and they do tend to be short. And they have rounded shapes in their chest and hips. They feel soft, they feel curvy. This is your romantic, your theatrical romantic, and also many soft gamines. So this type looks best in close necklines, fitted sleeves, fitted skirts, tapered legs, as well as short lines. So usually that means above the knee, but also above any of the stopping points, as well as round shapes in the chest and hips. So fitted waist, a really cinched waist, kind of a curvy hourglass silhouette wherever possible. Round sleeves, clingy fabrics on the chest and hips, kind of silk, soft fabrics that are also light and delicate. I really hope you found this video interesting. If you'd like to learn more about the body matrix, I highly recommend my book, How to Dress Your Best, which is out very, very soon. I honestly can't believe it. In fact, may even be out by the time you see this video. Oh my goodness. I would be so grateful if you would either pre-order or order this book. It took so much work from me and the team as well, who have curated photos and put it together and made it look absolutely stunning. It is so, so beautiful on the inside. And it's honestly a piece of art that we're all so, so proud of. Yeah, there's so much on the body matrix in here, so I would highly recommend it. Go check it out. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.